How would you describe the political climate generally in Europe right now?
I'd say it's poisonous in the sense that I've been in Europe almost 10 years, based out of Rome, but traveling a lot. And I think the mood in Europe now is worse than it was at the height of the crisis, the European crisis in 2011 and 2012. And I don't see it getting any better, especially since we have 3 or 4 really big elections coming up in the next few months, with the populist parties on the rise in many of these countries, and the good chance that in Italy we're going to get a populist Eurosceptic government.
When you say poisonous, what's seeding that poison?
The refugee crisis, for one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's hurt Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, a lot. It's driven the rise of Marine Le Pen, of the Front National in France. Less so Italy. There is even the mainstream parties in Italy are, I wouldn't say they're becoming overtly racist, but certainly the refugee crisis is hitting Italy very, very hard. 180,000 refugees came in 2016. And the polls actually say that the Italians, the level of xenophobia in Italy is the highest in Europe. I think it's something like 70% of Italians will admit to being afraid of foreigners and don't want them around.
It's an interesting shift. I mean, it's not just, you know, the Trump administration in the US where we see this rise of sort of nationalist populist sentiment. Obviously, Brexit's part of it. But Jeremy, based on your experience as you look at history, is there a different quality to that sort of nationalist populist sentiment in Europe because of their history, do you think?
I think that their history to some extent moderates it, because they do remember the notion that they're dropping back to the 30s, to that kind of populist nationalism. When Steve Bannon identifies the Trump administration as being a populist nationalist regime, Europeans are really staggered. You know? And I agree that refugees, which they call immigration, which isn't like our immigration, they're people they didn't ask for, have been a real challenge to identity, partly because they didn't ask for these people and they're not prepared. But it's been going on for 20, 25 years. I mean, the disaster situation in the Middle East spewed out, you know, a whole new wave of 1 million and more. But they'd been pouring in when I lived in Italy 20 years ago. You know, they were pouring in from Africa, and so the issue isn't sudden. And the nativist, populist, right-wing parties have been going at Brussels for 20 years. They blame Brussels for this, which is actually kind of unfair because Brussels has been rather inert on this issue. I'm not so pessimistic. I think that after Brexit, the polls showed that public opinion in Europe in favor of the European Union, approval, went up, even in Italy. It doesn't mean that the populist parties are going down, because in Italy and elsewhere, there are other reasons why they're supported. They're against the political establishments in their countries.
You're shaking your head here, Eric.
No, I've been doing some research on this, writing about it. The support for the EU and the euro is plummeting in Italy. The support for the euro, I'm going to get these numbers a bit wrong, but about 70% of the people in Eurozone countries support the euro. In Italy, it's down to 50%. Mm-hmm. Roughly, I think now it's switched on, I think more Italians, or as many or slightly more Italians, think that Italy will be better outside the euro than inside. So don't forget, this is a big economy. Italy is a big, big country. It's a founding member of the EU, original member of the Eurozone, one of the original 6. The whole idea in Italy was, let's become a member of the EU and the Eurozone because we don't trust our own government. We're going to outsource it all to Brussels. And that's changing a lot. And I think if the Eurozone goes down, it's going to be because of Italy.
So this past week, the Prime Minister was in Europe celebrating this new trade agreement with with Europe? Do you look at that then as kind of a last gasp if the situation is, if people are so negative about staying within the European
Well, they're not
Union?
negative throughout the EU or the Eurozone, but there are some key countries that are, one, Italy I would consider negative, and other countries the support is dropping. I mean, I don't see, the narrative is changing in Europe. I mean, the narrative in Europe was that the EU could solve our problems, whatever they were. Now what I'm seeing is that the EU is the source of our problems. Especially the euro, and that manifests itself in high unemployment rates, viciously high unemployment rates in the Mediterranean. I think that is the central problem, is the euro, and maybe by extension the EU is being blamed for the chronically high unemployment rates, which are unsustainable.
So put Brexit into the picture now, and if those other European countries are looking at the United Kingdom to see how that works. I mean, is that sort of a significant point in terms of whether or not the European Union hangs together?
I think, look, you have to differentiate between the people who are the prime ministers of these countries in Europe and the so-called people. I mean, more of the people still support the governments that are in power. So the right-wing nativist parties may be gaining, but I think some of them, like Marine Le Pen, have hit their ceiling. But that being said, Brexit offended Europeans. It offended a lot more Europeans than it encouraged other Europeans to try to do the same stuff. And Theresa May going to Washington and basically prostrating herself in front of Trump in favor of the mythical special relationship really got the Europeans goat, because this was no longer an economic disagreement with European partners. This was an existential statement of values. We don't share the same values that you do. So I don't see the European governments at all, dropping their tools. And the Canadian deal is more than just a deal with another country. We're the other North America, okay? It's a terrific brand to have, particularly when the United States is doing bad things like invading Iraq. We become quite popular. But it's because we share something, and that's liberal internationalism. We may be the last ones on the planet who do, but we're not giving up. And in history circles around, and this thing isn't going away.
I was going to say, is that what makes Trudeau popular in Europe, this idea of liberal internationalism, do you think, Eric?
I think he's popular because he's the un-Trump that he's...
the un-Trump.
The un-Trump that he's, well, good-looking guy, that helps. He's not building walls. Through CETA, the trade deal, he's taking walls down between Canada and Europe. And he's showing Europe that Canada can assimilate and integrate immigrants really, really well. So that's a lesson that Europeans want to hear. And this is what we can show Europe, how it has succeeded in cities like Toronto, Montreal, very, very well. So I think that gives Europeans some hope that, if the Canadians can figure this out on refugees and immigrants, maybe our crisis isn't a real full-blown crisis, and we should be able to figure this out some way.
He's also a very fresh new face who won election on an entirely positive campaign. And there's been so much negativity in campaigning everywhere else that hearing a voice that perhaps to some is naive, but that channels hope and aspiration and belief, it's terrific to hear.
So that's why Angela Merkel wants to stand beside him.
They want a piece of it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah. What should we be watching for? What do you think are the sort of critical points now? I know there are several elections this year in Europe, but what will you be watching for as signs of either positive or negative?
Well, I think you're going to, first of all, in the order they come, there's Holland, but Holland's going to be unresolved. It's going to be another coalition government, and the right-wing nativist group, Wilders, is going to probably lead the pack, but he's not going to be in government. So the big one coming up is France. And we'll see. I mean, this has been you couldn't have invented this story of the principal candidate from the right and getting wound up in this stuff about paying his wife hundreds of thousands of euros for a job she wasn't doing. And then suddenly this guy, 39-year-old Emmanuel Macron, who's kind of a Trudeau, suddenly emerges. When it comes to the runoff, Macron, I think, will certainly beat Marine Le Pen. It's all a question of turnout, but the French vote about 80% in their presidential elections in the second round. So I think we'll get through France. On Germany, it's suddenly become interesting because the socialists who were, declared dead in a sort of a collective autopsy suddenly have been revived by a new leader whom we knew in Brussels very well, Martin Schulz, who's kind of a good, recognizable German. But I think Angela Merkel is still popular enough to pull it off. There's the alternative right that they're making a push, but they're mostly in the East, and I don't think they're going to do it. I defer to Eric on Italy, but I would say that Beppe Grillo and his party is picking up largely frustration on the part of Italians, especially young Italians, with Italy rather than with the European Union, though I take the point about the euro. But you can get out of the euro and stay in the Union, theoretically.
Theoretically, that
That's right. So what are you watching for? What do you think are the critical points here?
I actually don't think the French and German elections are critical. I do not see a scenario where Marine Le Pen wins. I mean, I agree with you. I do not see a scenario where Angela Merkel loses. I do see a scenario where the Five-Star Movement, it's called Cinque Stelle, wins. They're marginally ahead in the polls. The Democratic Party is in array. That's the center-left party. We have a technocrat government right now. Matteo Renzi resigned in December, right in front of me, as a matter of fact. I was in the same room. And the Five-Star Movement is being supported. Yes, it's a protest movement, party, but also it's being supported by the young and jobless, of which there are millions and millions in Italy. And they're mostly in the South, but the South can swing this election. I believe they will win this election, and they've not threatened, they have promised to hold a referendum on the euro. Now you can debate whether this will be constitutionally legal. It may or may not be, but that's a very aggressive move. And even if it's a no vote to the euro and it's declared an invalid vote, it's still going to send a very powerful message to Brussels and the rest of Europe.
Thank you both very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.